Sabrina 70s comic, issue 7. We start out with Hilda telling Sabrina that she's gotta practice magic every day to become a good witch, even though she's clearly great at magic anyways. Probably because she's still not evil enough for her. So she still doesn't think of her as a good witch. Hilda tells Sabrina that she hasn't used her magic for days. How does she know? She's just assuming this. Maybe it's because she uses her magic for good, so she doesn't tell Hilda about that. Sabrina says that she doesn't want to use her powers for cheap tricks. Why? Hilda says, who else do you know who can sit on the ceiling? Okay, it does make sense that she doesn't waste her time using magic for that. I said why about, her using magic for mundane utilities. Then she uses magic to make Archie slip. He might have slipped anyways. Sabrina's sass finally calls her out. That was a mean thing to do. I don't want any part of that kind of witchcraft. You'd think Hilda would have gotten some respect for Archie after he tried to stand up for her when some con man tried to cheat her out of her island. Why do Hilda and Della think they're supposed to vex people? Sabrina says that there's enough of that in the world already, and they don't need to add to it. A pretty smart way for her to explain herself to her. Somehow, Hilda thinks she's not well and she gets to a witch doctor because it's not natural to feel like that. Why didn't they drop this kind of plot point after the first time? Why did they use it at all? If it's trying to be a joke, it's horribly unfunny. I think the joke is that Hilda and Zelda are irrational and weird, but if anything, Hilda almost seems to be there to represent people who would hate the Sabrina series because Sabrina's not like a normal witch. But I can't imagine anyone would ever be like that. So I don't get where this is coming from if it's not trying to respond to critics. Hilda plans on whipping up a powerful brew and laying a spell on Sabrina to bring her to her senses, in her words. Why didn't she do this a long time ago if she's okay with brainwashing her like that? I guess she was holding herself back for a long time because she still loves her, she's still her niece, and she just eventually slipped and got to the breaking point. But what took her so long? Why doesn't she just keep doing this? How would an experienced witch fail at this? Which she has to, because that would change the status quo. Sabrina thinks that her power comes from a different source instead of from sorcery. Huh? I thought sorcery was just another word for magic. Her magic comes from magic? So are we supposed to think Sabrina's right? Her power comes from a magically good god who doesn't do anything to help the world instead of, from evil spirits? That would bring up the question of, why aren't all the witches that way? Why aren't a lot more witches like that? Why are the evil witches even allowed to exist and keep being evil then? If Sabrina can be made this way. I prefer the idea that Sabrina's wrong here, because if her power came from Hilda's source, then it would make the fact that she's good all the more impressive. Hilda calls Sabrina for help because her kettle sprung a leak and her potion's leaking all over the floor. And she asks how she can cast the spell now. What the fuck? Since when do witches in this series need to have functional kettles to be able to cast spells? I've never seen Sabrina make a potion with a kettle in this comic. So that even contradicts the comic. How does this make sense? Hilda doesn't explain that she's got this dependency because she's old. Wouldn't she just cast a spell to fix the kettle immediately? Most of the time she uses magic in this comic, she uses it without the kettle, but I guess we're supposed to assume that the kettle potion is the source of her power, and it provides her with her powers even when she's not in the same room as it. Because it's just magical, of course. And I guess that can make sense if the leprechauns having their magic because of their gold in the 90s comic is a thing. It can be applied to witches too. But where's Sabrina's kettle? She has magic without having it. I guess she does have a kettle with potions somewhere. We just never see it. Sabrina takes this as a sign that it's right for her to be herself, as I'm still completely confused by Hilda's helplessness. She says a spell, not the specific spell she wanted. Sabrina says that something's calling her and she feels like using her magic. Hilda says that she's a real witch after all, and it was silly to worry about her. How did she not immediately realize that Sabrina might be talking about using magic for good? It doesn't make any sense that she'd go out here. It turns out Amanda is a flat tire. I wish it was explained that Sabrina's psychic, and that's why she knew to come here. Because she said something was calling her. Hilda's disappointed when Sabrina fixes the tire, and she somehow expects Sabrina to ruin things for a couple meeting in secret with a ladder. Sabrina has the father holding the ladder and makes sure the mother packs them lunch. The story ends with Hilda complaining. Her character would make sense if it was explained that she wants revenge on mortals in particular for mistreating her, and so she just wants to drag Sabrina into her revenge. But instead her character is too evil and exaggerated without explanation, so it's just confusing and annoying. It's not like she's pure evil, she's still nice to Sabrina. So that makes it even more confusing. It would make sense if she just wants to victimize mortals because she hates mortals, but she doesn't say that. So I'm just thinking that no one would ever be like this and get taken out of the story. Hilda complaining was just not only wasting most of the story, but also offsetting how good it felt to see Sabrina help people. In the next story, Ethel complains to Sabrina that no guy wants to be with her because of how she looks. Why does Ethel want to be called Big Ethel? She doesn't look big. Sabrina tells her to think positively and reassures her that she has some qualities other girls don't have. I wish she listed them, because I certainly don't remember them. And I read a bunch of those comics as a kid, so she can't be a memorable character then. I think she means she's nice, but isn't Betty supposed to be nice too? And she's pretty. Sabrina somehow thinks that things can't be that bad. Wouldn't she know Ethel? She shouldn't have needed to explain this to Sabrina. She tells her to look at her good qualities, and uses magic to give Ethel hidden beauty, clearly saying the spell right out loud in front of her with no consequences. She should have just had a thought bubble, and I shouldn't have had to say this more than once. I think this was much more rare in the 90s comic. Jughead just snarks for no reason instead of agreeing to join Ethel, but the spell does work because Archie says Ethel looks great today. So why didn't it work for Jughead? Is he just that much of a jerk that he could never appreciate her good qualities? Which is what the spell was about. Oh right, isn't he asexual? That was only stated to be the case in the reboot of Archie that I never read. But I don't know if that was what this writer intended. What other explanation is there? The spell's meant to prove to her that she won't die alone. Isn't Jughead Ethel's main crush? You'd think it would work on him. It's magic, it supersedes everything. Archie seems to only like Ethel because he thinks she looks beautiful. So maybe that is why it didn't work on Jughead. It's about attraction, because of beauty. Archie isn't being brainwashed into liking her. He's being brainwashed into thinking she looks beautiful, and that makes him like her. I'm still not being told what good qualities Ethel has. Do they expect the audience to be super familiar with her? Because I need a refresher on her personality. He has to buy her a Coke and puts his arm around her, feeling like he's looking at her for the first time. Too bad for Betty. Out of nowhere, with Jughead not explaining himself properly, Sabrina wonders if he never noticed Ethel because his eyes were closed. A joke about how he's always drawn. That shouldn't be referenced. It's not like he's literally blind. No, that'd be interesting. So we can't have that. That would add to the stories. It would make no sense for him to always have his eyes closed literally. It's supposed to be just an art style thing. She uses magic to open his eyes, and he just complains about the light hurting his eyes, and he can't shut them, and he's not used to all this brightness. So, his eyes are usually closed because he's extremely sensitive to light. But that doesn't explain why he's not stumbling around bumping into stuff like he's blind every story, if he's always literally got his eyes closed. We're not showing him having a blind man's cane or a blind man's dog. I don't think it works to have a literal interpretation of his eyes being drawn closed. It's not like he's psychic, and so he magically knows where he is anyways, or sees through his eyelids. It'd make more sense if we were told that he happens to only ever be shown in the middle of blinking. Wouldn't it make more sense for him to be wearing sunglasses if his eyes are sensitive to light, and he doesn't like showing them? Then he tells Ethel she looks pretty. It would have actually made more sense if Sabrina's spell worked on him right away, and then we could have skipped past some confusing padding. I thought they were just going with the idea that he's not into women or men because he never dates them. Why would he have walked past Ethel with his eyes closed? He asked her to go out with them, still not listing any of the good qualities that she supposedly has. Archie complains that he asked her first, and says, "You don't like girls anyway." So do they know what they were doing with Jughead even back then? Or did the thought not even occur to them because this is a 70s comic and they never get away with referencing that? Because Archie outright states this, And yet a character in the 70s is fine with who Jughead is. That's nice of him. It's just confusing because it's taking place in the 70s. Really, he's saying this because he's saying that he's a woman hater. And nowadays, him being called a woman hater would make him sound sexist, misogynist. But back then, it wasn't supposed to actually be interpreted like that. It was literally just supposed to mean that he didn't want to date girls. Sabrina undoes the spell to make them stop threatening to fight each other. I guess assuming that every guy would be like this if she didn't undo it. So, there was no point in the story. Because Ethel didn't even get a hug from them. So, she didn't get anything out of this. And most of the time I was just distracted by how confusing Jughead was. They don't remember what happened anymore and don't believe Ethel. Archie says that he has a date with Veronica tonight and offers to buy Jughead a burger. Predictably, the story ends with Ethel right back where she started. Fortunately, she says that this was the greatest day of her life anyways, and she's got her optimism back. So, it's her optimism that's her good quality. The story's like, oh, beauty isn't all that matters. You've got hidden beauty, and that's what matters. Please ignore that we're still insisting on calling it a form of beauty. You know, you could say she's generous, selfless, good at games, or smart. Nah, it just makes Sabrina delusional. And once again, Sabrina has no moral qualms about messing with people's minds into falling in love with someone, and planned on the spell lasting forever. But apparently if witches are allowed to mess with mortals, it makes sense that she wouldn't be punished for this. Well, maybe witches are such a minority that there's a reason we don't constantly see mysterious bad things happen to mortals because of them. I always assume Sabrina's family is basically the only witch in the city, in like any continuity. In the next story, we see Hilda coughing with soot on her, and Sabrina asks what happened to her because they were expecting her hours ago. Oh, instead of her falling down a chimney, it turns out she's mad about all the pollution over town. She had to fly around for hours because she couldn't see through the smog to come down. Why didn't she just use magic right away to clear away the fog that's around her so she could land immediately? Better yet, why was she too stupid to immediately warp back to Sabrina? They wouldn't be waiting for hours. Sure, she couldn't get rid of all the smog because she's opposed to doing good things for mortals, and that aroused suspicion. But she could get rid of some of it. Somehow she had to make a blind landing and ran into a big black smoke cloud. It really doesn't work to have a witch be inconvenienced by pollution for more than a second. I can understand her being annoyed with the smell, but she just zapped it away immediately. Hilda complains that it's bad enough witches have to worry about all the planes flying today when they're flying. She asks what's a witch supposed to do about pollution. I wish she added that wouldn't arouse suspicion that witches exist and create long-standing proof of us. Because if witches got rid of all the pollution themselves, mortals would notice, and they'd notice again even after their memories of seeing that were erased. Shouldn't the witches know that mortals would just give credit to the god they believe in instead to witches who they don't think exist or think of as evil? Sabrina says that some kids were protesting to get a confrontation with the leaders of the rubber company, the town's biggest polluters. First off, I wish she didn't call teenagers kids. Did any teenager talk like that? More importantly, I have to wonder what the point is of having a story with a message that pollution from factories is bad. Everyone knows that already. And stories about it aren't going to convince people to cut down on it if they're already sociopathic enough to not do so right away. Only severe fines against them would force them to clean up their act. What's the point of protesting? Is it in the hopes that fines would be enacted? Because otherwise, they sure are wishful thinkers if they expect their protesting to have any effect. They'd just be dismissed as hippies and ignored. Hilda insists on going down there tomorrow to make sure the inconsiderate mortals do something about those smokestacks. So can't she just brainwash them? Sabrina tells her they don't want any witchcraft, and the kids wouldn't understand it. Hilda says that humans don't understand anything anyway. Witches are humans though, they clearly look like it. She should have said mortals. And why is she saying this when mortals are smart enough to invent planes and witches don't have them? Well, to be fair, there's no proof that witches couldn't. They just don't need to. I imagine witches have futuristic technology, because magic could give them an infinite supply of electricity for anything. Somehow, Sabrina trusts Hilda when she tells her to promise her not to make a scene and embarrass her. This is so predictable. Well, I'm excited to see what exactly Hilda's gonna do. She's gonna be an escapist character for the writer and us to feel great about living through, as she tells off a villain that everyone hates. Archie says that the protesters have an appointment to talk with a bigwig at 1 o'clock. Is that realistic? I don't know how these things work. I just remember that protesters tend to get arrested, even hit with gas, or literally hit by the police for protesting and stuff like that. Hilda doesn't want to sit around for 4 hours, so she insists on seeing him now. Idealistically thinking that he doesn't understand the seriousness of the problem. He does, he just doesn't care because he's getting money. Hilda uses magic to get rid of the locked door in front of the secretary, confusing her, and barges into the company president's room to tell him off. She actually tells him that she was flying around on a broom, saying that 5 birds hitched a ride. She wants to send him the cleaning bill for ruining 3 of her best outfits. Why can't she just use magic to clean them instantly? I guess her point is she didn't want to have to clean them to begin with. She says she'll go home and conjure up a potion that'll put him out of business. Why does she expect him to be threatened by her? Doesn't she know that mortals nowadays don't believe in witches and aren't allowed to because they're forced to forget about them? It's so annoying that instead of Hilda being written to use magic against them, like I thought would happen, like was being built up to, Sabrina uses magic to put her in a daze. If this was an early Superman comic, we would have seen him be forced to deal with the problem up in the air because of magic, and he'd admit he was wrong. I'd imagine Hilda to pick him up and fly on her broom with him and bring him to the pollution. And Sabrina in this comic is kind of like the earliest Superman comics, because she's able to do anything with her magic, and she often uses her magic for good. And there isn't any villain that can actually challenge her. So I would expect Sabrina to show him the errors of his ways, not be useless. She tells her that she'd blow it for the teenagers, and of course it's already too late and the appointment's been called off, as the psychotic cartoon villain says he's sick of them telling him what he has to do to save the environment, calling the teenagers spoiled for no reason at all. He says he's been running the business for 30 years without any problems until teenagers came along. I doubt only teenagers would be protesting. Why does he think that's all hogwash that he's ruining the town by polluting the air? He says that when Sabrina gets the factories to do something about it, he'll do something. He also smokes in the office, because it's the 70s and they could get away with that. Hilda cathartically calls out Sabrina that she should have let her zap him. Sabrina says that she can't force people to do what she wants, even if she's right. You're one to talk! You've brainwashed people into falling in love! A lot! Hilda complains, and Sabrina says that they have to make people think they're doing this on their own, by giving them a taste of their own pollution. Why didn't Hilda do that? Why didn't she do this a lot earlier? Sabrina uses magic to send the pollution in the air towards the factory employees, who insist that they're not coming back to work unless the boss does something about all the smoke. Too bad the story ends there instead of showing it's a happy ending, which would have obviously been necessary to make this all worth it. Sabrina's usually all about helping people. You'd think Hilda would have done this. What was the point of the story? I doubt anyone running a factory is going to read this, and they'd be too sociopathic and greedy to have their minds changed if they did. This kind of story does nothing but preach to the choir with a Captain Obvious S-up. Go figure, pollution is bad. No duh. What's a normal person supposed to do about it? An environmental message would work telling you how to reuse, and telling you what exactly is recyclable, in what exact way. Having the characters be told about it. I wish it was explained why Hilda doesn't zap away all the pollution, because she doesn't seem to be afraid of telling him she's a witch, which would be illegal in a sitcom. Of course, if she used magic to make it so that the factory wasn't polluting anymore, but was still functioning, mortals would notice that and freak out. Well, that should have been pointed out. In the next story, we started out seeing Hilda making a potion in her cauldron, and Sabrina wishes they could just have an outdoor grill like everyone else. Why is she doing this outside? Out of complete nowhere, she says that if they're gonna keep their magical powers, they have to make a new batch of brew. So witches keep their powers in this comic by making brew from stuff that has magic on its own for no reason, but needs to be brought out by brewing. I guess potion ingredients having magic for no reason makes just as much sense as the magic being in a witch's DNA for no reason. Only witches can take advantage of the brew because of their unique DNA. Something in their DNA reacts to magic. Maybe the more they have of it, the more powerful they are. Hilda gives Sabrina a list of things to get for her instead of simply zapping them up to her herself, which will be way faster. She even says that she needs the ingredients right away. Why would she have a mere list instead of photos of what's needed so she can warp it to her? I guess the ingredients are enchanted so that any witch can't just warp them to them, or zap them out of thin air, because that'd be creating magic from nothing, and that'd just be silly. Sabrina says she has a date with Harvey. She's told she needs ingredients right away, and right away Harvey says that he thought they were going to the beach. Did he hear all of this? Everyone assumes she's just really into cosplaying as a witch, I guess. It's refuge and audacity. Of course, he could just be playing dumb, but of course I guess we're supposed to believe that if he knew she was a witch, he'd be taking advantage of her for it. Sabrina calls it a shopping list, and says she'll have to take care of it first. How does she drop it? Of course Harvey reads the list, and says that he's heard of health foods, but this is ridiculous. The weird conclusions mortals come to try to not believe in witches. Sabrina says that Eye of Newt and Scale of Dragon are just a special family recipe. She should say they are health food. Then a store, I guess, teleports to her, which would explain why I asked what kind of store is that. Either that or it's always surrounded by light. He's told to wait there, as she knew that he saw that, and didn't care. It clearly has a sign on it saying, "Your witch is our command," and another one saying, "Park brooms here," and someone clearly says, "Happy hexing" from inside the place. She's definitely planning on erasing his memories of this if this doesn't... Wow, we actually see Sabrina erase his memory of it. That makes me wonder why she's not shown doing this every time, other than it being repetitive. And I guess the writer thinks that if she was shown doing this too much, she'd look morally shady for messing with people's minds. The story ends with Hilda being humiliated by the smoke from the brew because that was a bad year for dragon scales. Huh? Why? Also, I guess Hilda called a person in the building with a witch cell phone or telepathy to tell them to make the store show up on Earth. It'd make more sense if she gave Sabrina a photo for visualization or a number combination and told her to use the other realm closet so she could warp to the store. The first story frustrated me, reminding me that Hilda doesn't like Sabrina being nice when I already knew that, so why waste pages on it? Then she whips up a brew to try to brainwash her into being evil, making me wonder what took her so long. And there's no explanation for why she won't do this again after the cauldron springs a leak. At least we see Sabrina use her magic for good a few times. The second story is nice to Ethel for a change, with Sabrina using magic to brainwash Archie and Jughead into falling in love with her for her hidden beauty. I wish I was reminded of what Ethel's good traits are. Instead they just say she's beautiful now, without listening why they like her. And she has to undo the spell because men start fighting over her, which she should have anticipated. It's yet another story that has Sabrina use love spells. The third story takes too long spelling out the message that pollution is bad, when everyone already knows that, because the writer really wanted to rant about it that day. And after we have to put up with a sociopathic factory owner, Sabrina stops Hilda from using magic to humiliate him. Although it was funny how Hilda wasn't even trying to hide that she was a witch. Then Sabrina uses magic to send the pollution at the factory employees and boss so they'll quit if the smoke isn't dealt with. Not enough emphasis to put in the fact that the factory owner had to deal with the pollution too. He doesn't talk as much as the others do. There isn't an extra panel after this where he says he'll improve the factory. Wouldn't Hilda have done this? We should have seen a happy ending where the factory isn't polluting anymore, but instead just ends there, making the whole thing seem pointless. All because it wasted so many pages because the beginning of it had Hilda complaining at length because she flew into pollution and somehow didn't just immediately warp home. It's frustrating that factories pollute in real life, so why would I want to be reminded about that in a lighthearted kids comic? It's not like the factory boss is the main antagonist of the entire franchise, like Robotnik, and so we'd need attention to be drawn to this to always know why the main villain should be rooted against. I doubt the story changed any minds, so what was the point? I guess the writer wished he was Hilda and Sabrina here, so it was cathartic for him, but still stayed grounded in reality, because it's not like every factory was cured of pollution after this. Sabrina tried to emphasize the kind of realistic way of dealing with the problem, because people were protesting and wanted to meet with the factory owner. The final story has Sabrina go get potion ingredients for Hilda from a store as we see Harvey's reaction to it. What was the point of that? It'd be more interesting to see the inside of the store, wouldn't it? Why didn't Hilda just teleport the potion ingredients to her? I have to assume they're enchanted and you can't create new magic, but that's not explained. Why didn't she just get them herself? If Sabrina wanted an outdoor grill, why didn't she use her magic to get one? Well, I couldn't help but find it interesting that in this universe, witches need to make brews to keep their powers, because I've never seen that before. I always assume they're genetic. I wish I knew what the frequency of brew making has to be. Sure, it's convenient that fate happened to decide that certain potion ingredients attracted natural magic to them like magnets. And the same couldn't be said for other things. But it's equally convenient that some people would be born witches. Witch DNA is just as magnetic to magic.